tayo ng Math-aral. Sa Math, walang maiiwan. Math-sayang Math-aral tayo ng Math-tuto, upang ikayo masenso. Maging matyaga, maging matalino, halina Math-aral na tayo. Maging matyaga, maging matalino, halina Math-aral na tayo. Halina Math-aral na tayo. Halina Math-aral na tayo. Halina, 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 Math-aral na tayo.
And now, to discuss the lesson for grade 8. She is a graduate of Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Mathematics at Rizal Technological University, and currently taking Masters of Art and Mathematics Education at Rizal Technological University. Let us welcome Mrs. Mary Grace V. Manso.
Good day, Batang MANDunong. I am Mary Grace V. Manso, Mathematics Teacher 1 from Isaac Lopez Integrated School. So for today, I'm going to discuss Quarter 3, Week 7 lessons with competency, proofs, statements on triangle congruence. So for this week, we have two objectives. The first one, we are going to recall on how to prove two triangles are congruent, and we're going to prove statements on triangle congruence. So when do we say that triangles or the two triangles are congruent? So two triangles are said to be congruent if all three corresponding sides are equal and all the three corresponding angles are equal in measure. So let's have an example. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. So let's identify the corresponding congruent angles and their corresponding congruent sides. So let's start with corresponding congruent angles of the two triangles. So angle A is correspond to angle D. So therefore, angle A is congruent to angle D because these two triangles are congruent. Then we have angle B is correspond to angle E, and angle B is congruent to angle E. And next, angle C corresponds to angle F. So therefore, angle C is congruent to angle F. Next, let's proceed to corresponding congruent sides. So side AB corresponds to side DE. So therefore, these two sides are congruent. Next, side BC is congruent to side EF. So therefore, these two sides are congruent. Next, side CA corresponds to side FD. So therefore, side CA is congruent to side FD. In proving statements in geometry, we use axioms, postulates, and theorems or even definitions. So here are some axioms, postulates, and theorems that we're going to use in proving statements on triangle congruence. So let's start with triangle congruence postulate. So we have side, 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 or SSS postulate. So this is the postulate states that if the three sides of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding three sides of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. Next, we have the side, angle, side, or Sas postulate. So this postulate states that if two sides and an included angle of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two sides and an included angle of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. Next, we have the angle, side, angle, or Asa postulate. This postulate states that if two angles and the included side of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two angles and an included side of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. And we also have the side angle or SAA theorem, or some books ang gamit nila rito ay angle side or AAS theorem. So this theorem states that if the two angles and a non-included side of a one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two angles and an non-included side of another triangle, then these two triangles are congruent. Next, we have the theorems in right triangles. So, the first one is the Hypotenuse Leg Theorem or the Ll Theorem. So, this theorem states that if the hypotenuse and one leg of a right triangle are congruent to the hypotenuse and one leg of another right triangle, then the two right triangles are congruent. Next, we have leg acute angle theorem or LA theorem. If a leg and an acute angle of one right triangle are congruent to the corresponding leg and an acute angle of another right triangle, then these two right triangles are congruent. Next, we have the leg or LL theorem. If the legs of one right triangle are congruent to the corresponding legs of another right triangle, then these two right triangles are said to be congruent. We also have different properties to use in proving statements on geometry. So we have the properties of equalities. So the first one is reflexive property of equality. Second is symmetric property of equality. Third, transitive property of equality. Fourth, addition property of equality, which is APE. We also have subtraction property of equality or SPE. Multiplication property of equality or MPE. Division property of equality and substitution property of equality. At meron din tayong tinatawag na properties of congruence. So, there are three. The first one is reflexive property of congruence, symmetric property of congruence, and transitive property of congruence. We are now ready to prove a statement on triangle congruence. So, let's start with example number 1. So, given this figure and what are the given statements? So, we have the first one is side GL is congruent to side GN. So, lagyan natin siya ng markings. So, side GL is congruent to side GN. And another given statement, we have angle GLE is congruent to angle GNO. So, lagyan ulit natin ng markings. So, angle GLE is congruent to angle GNO. Next, what statement are we going to prove? So, we need to prove that side LE is congruent to side NO. So, in geometry, in proving statements in geometry, usually ang ginagamit yung two-column proving. So, prove. So, the first column is for the statements and for the second column is for the reasons. So in every statement there should be a corresponding reason. So our first statement will be side GL is congruent to side GN and angle GLE is congruent to angle GNO. So our reason there is given. Okay, balikan natin tong figure. So, looking at the figure, you will notice that we can form two triangles. So we can form triangle GLE and triangle GNO. So, at yung dalawang triangle na yun ay nag-share lang sa isang angle or common vertex. So, our second statement will be angle angle L, GE is congruent to angle NGO. So, ito yun. Or pwede rin natin kasi sabihin na angle G is congruent to angle G. So, what will be our reason for that statement? Of course, reflexive property. Next, for our third statement, so may nakita na kayo, so nakita natin yung dalawang triangle. So, we can say that triangle GLE is congruent to triangle GNO kasi meron na siyang tatlong corresponding parts na congruent. So, ano magiging reason natin dyan? So, we have angle, congruent angles, congruent side, congruent angles. So, angle, side, angle. So, that is Asa postulate or angle, side, angle postulate. Next. So, since naprove na natin na yung dalawang triangles na to ay congruent, so pwede na nating masabi na yung side LE is congruent to side NO by CPCTC or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So, lagyan na natin siya ng mark. So, side LE is congruent to side NO. Okay, let's proceed to example number 2. So, this is the given figure. And given statements are side GB is congruent to side NV. And we also have angle G is congruent to angle N. And we need to prove that angle I is congruent to angle E. So again, we will use the two-column proving. So statements and reason. So our first statement will be side GB is congruent to side NV and angle G is congruent to angle N. So, the reason is given. Next. For the second statement, kung ito ay angle, side, then dito tayo sa angle na to. So, angle GVI is congruent to angle NVE. So, what kind of angles are they? Okay, that is vertical angle. So our reason is vertical angle theorem. So, if the angles are vertical, then they are congruent. Next, since angle GBI, so ito yon, is congruent to angle NVE. So, lagyan natin siya ng markings. So, 1, 2, 1, 2. So, since meron na tayong 3 corresponding congruent parts of the two triangles, pwede na nating masabi na ang dalawang triangles na to ay congruent. So, triangle GVI is congruent to triangle NVE. So, what will be our reason? So, we have angle, side, angle. angle, side, angle. So our reason there is Asa Postulate. So, what do you mean by Asa Postulate? If two angles and an included side of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two angles and an included side of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. So, since we already proved that these two triangles are congruent, so yung remaining parts nito, pwede na nating masabi na congruent. So, our last statement will be angle I is congruent to angle E. So, what will be our reason? So, our reason is CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So, lagyan natin siya ng marking. So, angle E, 1, 2, 3, is congruent, angle I is congruent to angle E. 1, 2, 3. So, let's have example number 3. So, given this figure and a statement that side SU is congruent to side VU. And we need to prove that side ST is congruent to side VT. So again, we will use two-column proving. So our first statement will be side SU is congruent to side VU. So our reason is given. Next, for our second statement, so tignan natin yung figure. So by looking at this, at the given figure, we will notice that, we can notice that TU divides divides the big triangle into two right triangles. So our next statement will be side TU is congruent to side TU. Kasi pag pinaghiwalay natin tong dalawang right triangles na to, we will have right triangle SUT tsaka right triangle VUT at gamit nila parehas ang side TU. So TU is side TU is congruent to side TU. So our reason is reflexive property. Next, since meron na tayong, so lagyan muna natin ang markings ng TU. So side TU is congruent to side TU. So since the two triangles are right triangles, so pwede na nating masabi na these two right triangles ay congruent kasi meron ng two corresponding congruent parts. Ito yung legs. Leg SU tsaka leg TU. They are congruent. So our next statement will be triangle SUT is congruent to triangle VUT. So what will be our reason? So since right triangle siya, dun tayo kukuha. So our reason is leg-leg theorem or Ll Theorem. If the two legs of one right triangle are congruent to the corresponding two legs of another right triangle, then the two right triangles are congruent. Next, since na-prove na natin that these two right triangles are congruent, then yung remaining parts nito, remaining corresponding parts, ay congruent na din by, so our statement will be, so side ST is congruent to side VT. So what will be our reason? So again, our reason will be CPCTC or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So example number 4. So this is the figure for example number 4. So given segment OM is a bisector of angle SOE. So ibig sabihin segment OM is an angle bisector. At ang function when we say angle bisector, it is a line or segment that divides the angle into two equal angles. And another given, we have angle S is congruent to angle E. And we need to prove that point M is the midpoint of side SE. Para masabi natin na midpoint ang point M, dapat mapatunayan natin na ang side SM at side EM ay equal or congruent. So, let's start proving. So, first statement, OM is a bisector of angle SOE. So, our reason is given. Next, since segment OM is an angle bisector, so therefore, we can have two congruent angles. Ano yung two congruent angles natin? Iyon ang angles SOM and angle EOM. So, we have angle SOM is congruent to angle EOM. So, what will be our reason? Definition of angle bisector. Next. So, for our third statement, since meron pa tayong given statement dito, so we have angle S is congruent to angle E. So, our reason is given. Okay. For our fourth statement, so, tingnan natin itong triangle na to. So, meron siyang given na two congruent angles. So, these are the base angles. So, therefore, this triangle is an isosceles triangle. And, kung ang angle S at angle E ay congruent, so therefore, at ito ay an isosceles triangle, so, ibig sabihin, ang kanilang opposite sides ay congruent din. So, meaning, side SO is congruent to side EO by converse of isosceles triangle theorem. So, ano ba ibig sabihin ng converse of isosceles triangle theorem? So, it means that if two angles of an isosceles triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite of these angles are also congruent. So, lagyan natin ang marking. So, side SO is congruent to side EO. So, we have now three corresponding congruent parts of the two triangles. Triangle O, SM, at triangle OEM. So, pwede na natin masabi na these two triangles are congruent. So, we have our fifth statement will be triangle OSM. So, dito natin. So, triangle OSM is congruent to triangle EOM. So, what will be our reason? So, tingnan natin yung mga markings natin. So, we have angle, side, angle. Angle, side, angle. So, what will be our reason? Asa Postulate. Okay, next statement. Since napatunayan na natin na these two triangles are congruent, so yung remaining parts ng two congruent angles at two congruent triangles na to ay congruent din. So, meaning, side SM is congruent to side EM by CPCTC. Congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So, kung itong side SM ay congruent sa side EM, we can now say that point M is the midpoint of side SE. So, our last statement will be point M is the midpoint of side SE by the definition of midpoint. So, let's try this. Directions. Write the complete proof of the given below. So, this is the given. So, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Side RA is congruent to side EC. And we need to prove that angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. So, let's start proving. So, for our first statement, we have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So, our reason is given. Next statement. Okay. So, kung ang angle 1 ay congruent sa angle 2, so therefore, this big triangle ay an isosceles triangle. So, kung itong base angles na to ay congruent, so therefore, the sides opposite these two congruent angles are also congruent. So, we have side R or GR is congruent to side GE by converse of isosceles triangle theorem. So, lagyan natin ng markings. So, side GR is congruent to side GE. Next. So, meron pa tayong statement dito. So, our third statement is side RA is congruent to side EC. So, our reason is given. So, lagyan natin ulit ng markings. Side RA is congruent to side EC. Okay. So, mapapansin nyo, we have two congruent triangles. Ito. So, our next statement, we have triangle GRA is congruent to triangle GEC. So, what will be our reason? So, check natin ulit yung marking. Side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. So, our reason is Sas Postulate. This postulate states that if the two sides and an included angle of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding sides and an included angle of another triangle, then these two triangles are congruent. Next. So, since na-prove na natin na itong dalawang triangles na to ay congruent, so therefore, side GA and side GC are congruent. So, by CPCTC, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So, lagyan natin siya ng markings. So, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, we can prove that angle 3 and angle 4 are congruent. So, since itong legs na to ay congruent, so meaning this triangle is an isosceles triangle. And if these two legs or two sides are congruent, then the angles opposite these two congruent legs or sides are also congruent. So, we have our next statement. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 4 by isosceles triangle theorem. So, what do you mean by isosceles triangle theorem? So, lagyan muna natin to ng markings. So, an isosceles triangle theorem states that if the two sides of an isosceles triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite these two congruent sides are also congruent. Salamat, Batang MANDunong, especially sa aking mga estudyante from 8 Sinon, 8 Helium, at 8 Titanium. Once again, I'm Teacher Mary Grace B. Manso from Isaac Lopez Integrated School. Thank you.